The rules for the second debate are essentially identical to the rules for the first debate. The candidates got a coin toss for who goes first and who does the first close. Questions have been submitted from the audience. I may ask some of the same questions for the state Senate candidates that we asked for the state representative candidates. However, I will tell you that I am not going to ask the question about who do you support for president.
Thank you very much.
And for the 5 of you who asked it, harumph. This question will go to Mr. France first. In running for the 36th district, what skills do you have that will improve the state's fiscal situation, and what will you do to bring jobs back to Connecticut?
So first, I want to thank the League of Women Voters for putting on yet another great debate here in 2016. I also want to thank each and every one of you for coming. Obviously, you care more than the average person does. And what's particularly encouraging to me is we're looking at a great group of younger folks here tonight, which is very unusual. These things tend to be a little on the dull side for the younger crowd. But we've got a group from Brunswick School over there. It looks like about 7 or 8 people over there. Thank you guys for coming. The democratic process is a great one, as you know, and for democracy to get whittled down over the course of time is not good for this country. So I have faith in you. Some of you I know, and I'm particularly proud of you guys for coming here and also for standing up for what you believe in when it comes to democracy. So the question, I almost forgot it, is what skills do I have? No, please don't. I don't want to burn any more time up. But skills that I have, so my background is in finance and private equity, and that's about a 17-year career before getting into state office, state service. And so the skills that I bring are very good financial skills in terms of being able to tear apart budgets, look at balance sheets, and understand exactly what's going on. And that's something I hope we talk a lot about before the night is over, because we are really in dire straits. 14 years of service to the state in economic development, another 8 years on top of that in transportation in the Bradley International Airport is my background.
Mr. Blankley.
Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to you. I recognize most people here, which is very nice, actually, for all the time that I've been involved in politics in our town. The qualities that I bring to this situation, it is as if my whole life has been directed to this moment. No one has gone to Hartford who has handled budgets bigger than the budget of the state of Hartford. I have. No one has dealt with unions in a takeover situation as I have. No one has done the biggest high-yield bond deal that's ever been done. I have. No one has restructured the worldwide asset ownership of a major international company for tax optimization purposes as I have. And on top of that, no one has started a company 15, 16 years ago, as I did, that is now a multi-million-dollar business with dozens of employees in the state of Connecticut. So my big corporate background in terms of restructuring, capital market activity, and my activities as an entrepreneur qualify me to deal with the problems that our state does have. Those problems cannot be minimized, and we should talk about them. And however, I will talk just a little bit later about some of the things we should be talking about that are positive about our state, and that you will hear from me momentarily.
Okay, Mr. France, any rebuttal or extension?
The world of government is very, very different from that of the private sector. And John is a very successful person in his own right, both in the larger corporate experiences that he's had, but also here more recently in the world of a smaller business, called a medium-sized business, I would imagine. But it works very, very differently, and up there in Hartford in particular. And to be in a position where you can actually make a difference, where you can actually negotiate, you have to be there for, and if you remember the majority party, about 14 or 16 years before you can really make a difference.
Time. Anything further, Mr. Blankley?
I think so, yes. Government is slow. I sit on the Board of Estimate and Taxation here in town, and trying to get projects through in this town is a slow process, and I know that it's exactly the same at the state level. So I'm well aware of the problems that we face as far as government versus what it's like in the commercial sector.
Okay. That is it for this question. The next one goes to Mr. Blankley first. Our state budget is out of balance. How would you balance it?
Right now, it's in balance. But let me start off. I alluded earlier to what we should be thinking about in terms of what is positive about our state. We have the fourth highest GDP per capita in the entire country. For our small state, that's not bad. For productivity, we're third in the entire United States. Household income is fourth in the entire United States. For innovation, we rank fifth. We are the seventh ranking in terms of patents that are written. We are eighth as far as R&D investment is concerned, and as far as quality of life goes, we are third. That's not bad. That's the reason why my wife and I came here over 30 years ago. Problems have developed during the time that we've been here, and I don't want to minimize them, but I absolutely insist on talking about the things that are good in our state. It's morning again in Connecticut. The glass is half full, so let's just bear that in mind. People are leaving the state, but people are coming to the state. The population of the state of Connecticut has stayed steady and slightly rising the past 5 years. We've lost 3 billionaires, perhaps, in the past 3 years, but we are not going to manage the affairs of our state for the sake of a couple of billionaires. We're going to manage it for us.
All right, Mr. France.
So on the floor of the state Senate recently, this last spring during session, there was a very intense debate about whether people are actually leaving the state of Connecticut or not. Majority party typically wants to ignore that because it doesn't really fit their narrative. And so after describing to a particular person that I was in a debate with on the floor of the Senate, I said, if you don't want to believe it, I can tell you 3 families just in the last 4 months have declared their residency in Florida. It takes about a year and a half to finally make the break, but they've declared their residency in the state of Florida, and with them, they are bringing $23.5 billion worth of net worth, and they're either hedge fund managers themselves or they have access to the best in the world, and they earn 20 to 25% per year. The 6.99% that you are not allowed to use itemized deductions on goes away. It goes to Florida. That is hundreds of millions of dollars. We can't balance a budget to save our lives if we don't have those people in our state. And on top of that, I get the answer that there are more millionaires in the state of Connecticut than there ever has been before. Well, simple math will tell you that a billion is not 100 million, it's not 10 million, it's 1,000 million. So maybe they've doubled the number of millionaires in the state of Connecticut, but you lose 1 billionaire from, unfortunately, our town, and you're talking in many cases 40 or 50 times that amount of resource, which turns into cash flow earnings.
Any rebuttal?
So the tax rate goes from 6.7% to 6.9%, and a billionaire leaves. Well, I'm sorry about that. It's something that has been happening for decades. People have been leaving the state. They go to Florida, they go to North Carolina, they go wherever. This is the fate of states throughout the Northeast, and it's nothing peculiar to our state. So let's be very careful about self-flagellation as far as we Connecticutians are concerned. There are many things that we can do and can do right, and I intend to address them this evening.
Anything further, Mr. France?
Yeah, sure. They have been leaving for a long time. That's because the natural tendency is for people in the Northeast to, when they get to a certain age, start to look to the South. But nowadays, we're talking about catastrophic amounts of net worth that's moving out of the state, and it goes through the entire spectrum of the demographics of the state of Connecticut, to the point where, because people, the director of Department of Revenue Services knows that I know most of these people down here in Fairfield County and Greenwich in particular, and they'll come every once in a while and say, could you please figure out whether we can get that person to stay if we cut a deal?
Time. I'm going to go to the next question, and it goes to Mr. France first. The governor has asked departments to submit agency budgets with across-the-board spending cuts. Where do you support or oppose spending cuts?
Well, we have to, at some point, get our budget under control. We've grown our budget over 40 years at a rate just shy of 7%. And if you do the simple math on that, and we all know that the most powerful force in the universe is compounding, right? Dr. Einstein taught us that, so did Warren Buffett. But you've got a hockey stick effect after about 22 years or so. You start looking at this when you're talking about 6.7%. over 40 years, you're starting to get into real steep kind of territory here. And then you look at the potential of the tax base, the population itself, and you look at CPI, which is up a little bit higher, and you look at but personal income, which is about the same as CPI over that period of time. There's a huge disconnect. You've got to get the expense structure of Connecticut under control. Otherwise, we don't stand a chance because the clock is working against us and mathematics is working against us. If we don't do that, we're dead in the water. And our unfunded liabilities of roughly $73 billion added to our bonded indebtedness of $23.6 billion is massive. That's nearly $100 billion of money that we owe contractually, whether it's to retirees or whether it's to the bondholders. And you divide by what used to be 5.6 million people. We've lost population, 5.91 million people. If you do the simple math on that on your iPhone, there's a little app that you can pull up, you'll see a number that is just staggering and completely unaffordable.
Mr. Blankley.
Population of the state of Connecticut has been 3.5 million, between 3.5 and 3.6 million for decades and decades and decades. And it's that period of time that we're talking about. But you know what? It's what we're doing now and what we're going to do for the future that counts. So there's a plan on the table to deal with the unfunded pension liabilities. They are there. It's $26 billion. And there's a plan on the table. Nothing has been done about it. I dare say that people in my party have done nothing about it. But why has it not been brought forward by people from the other party? So I intend to go to Hartford to do something about it. Second of all, infrastructure. There is a plan on the table to create an infrastructure bank. That would help fund the $100 million over 30 years, the plan that the governor has put on the table. Why has that not been implemented? Execution is needed. Government may be slow, but we need to do something. Job creation. This is the third plank of my platform, as a matter of fact. I can walk the talk when it comes to job creation. I know about some of the government agencies that try to help businesses. And you may get philosophical about whether government should be active in that area, but I think we all have to swallow the fact that maybe it should. And I would say there's a lot more that can be done.
All right. Any rebuttal?
Not really a rebuttal, just in addition to it, the economic development policy that the administration has been engaged in for the last 5.5 years, 5.75 years now, is a very aggressive one. And I do take my hat off to him for being aggressive. You have to do that with corporate leaders these days. But when you look at the nearly $2 billion of your tax dollars or borrowing proceeds that you're on the hook for down the road. By the way, my predecessor, who's a great guy, Senator Bill Nickerson, is nice enough to be here also. Thank you for showing up. That means more than you could possibly know. Thank you. So
I'm afraid, unfortunately,
did I just burn on my time?
Yes, sir.
His fault.
Anything further, Mr. Blankley?
And my neighbor, I should say.
All right. Next question will go to Mr. Blankley first. It is one that was also asked of the representative candidates. Transportation is critical for Fairfield County and the state. What can be done to improve traffic flow here? Specifically, how will you work to alleviate the traffic problems on I-95?
Well, you know, we've been in Connecticut, in Greenwich, for over 30 years, and it wasn't long after we first arrived when a span broke on 95, killing some people. And that was our first introduction to possible failing infrastructure in this country that we had come to. It was also our first introduction to state troopers. What is a state trooper? Well, it turns out they're to keep people from New York out. And, but it made me think about, what is going on. So these past 30 years, things have obviously deteriorated as far as rails are concerned, as far as the roads are concerned, certainly 95 and certainly the Merritt Parkway. I have an office in Shelton. I have a business based in Shelton, as I mentioned before. We send engineers all around the state, and if there's one burden that we have, it is dealing with the problem of congestion on the roads. So I mentioned earlier an infrastructure bank. That, I think, is the main way that we are going to get to thinking about some of these problems and financing things. The governor has said where 95 is 3 lanes, he wants it 4. Where it's 2 lanes, he wants it 3. There is a study that was financed by a bond issue just in the last term that will enable us to see whether that is going to be feasible or not. So rather than some of us who are frankly laymen speculating about whether it should be more rail, whether it should be by sea, using the ports or whatever, that study will be a proper engineering feasibility study. And I look forward to seeing the results.
Mr. France.
I agree. I look forward to seeing the results of that study. But we have to keep in mind that this issue has been studied ad infinitum for 50 years now, ever since the completion of I-95, and I'm sure it was done even before that, when the Merritt Parkway was showing signs of overuse, as well as Route 1, the Post Road. So, so how do you improve? But most of these studies come up with solutions that are either ignored or they're not realistic. So how do you improve traffic flows on I-95 in particular? The Merritt Parkway is horrible these days, unfortunately, during rush hour as well. It's fluid dynamics. You need to get very creative. You need to think outside of the box, which is a challenge when you're talking about the Department of Transportation. You all might not have had exposure to the Department of Transportation, but I know you've had exposure to the Department of Motor Vehicles. They make DOT look like the devil. So there's very little imaginative thinking. It's a very plodding, slow-moving organization that when you go to them and you say, let's do a little traffic study here, exit 3, as a matter of fact, here. When you're going southbound on I-95 and you get off, and you have to stop about a mile before you get to exit 3, it's an accident, tragedy just waiting to happen. And when you say to the DOT guys, let's do a perpetual, for 90 minutes anyway, right-hand turn only, green light, no red light, no nothing. Everybody has to go to the right. And even if you want to take a left and get to, say, the Lescal, you have to go around the block. Big deal. You got the traffic off the highway.
All right. Anything further?
When it comes to the DMV, my business is outsourcing. So I am sure that there is something that can be done as far as outsourcing that particular activity. When it comes to 95 and where we might go over the next 20 to 30 years, the president of the Fairfield County Business Association suggests that we don't actually need to expand 95. What we need is to introduce self-driving cars, which are on the way, as we know. So that is really thinking out of the box.
Anything further?
Yes, self-driving cars, I think we have to watch that very, very carefully. It's a little bit of a pie-in-the-sky kind of thing. We know that there have already been some accidents, and while it's what was the name of that show, the Jetsons? It kind of reminds me of the Jetsons a little bit. I don't think it's going to happen. It's like, very light jets. They said that the sky is going to darken with these really completely affordable little airplanes that everybody could buy and keep in their garage and fly around. It's not going to happen in the same way that they're describing it to you now. Yes, there will be certain components on a car that will be controlled by the computer if you choose to do so. Or sometimes it's a passive braking system, as we've all seen in the Subaru commercials.
Do you want further rebuttal?
One small comment, if I may. When Alexander Graham Bell introduced the telephone in, when was it, the 1870s, he said to a general of the army, well, look at this, isn't this a wonderful device? And the general of the army said, I really can't see how that could be useful at all. So, let's not turn our back on potential innovation.
Anything further, Mr. France?
No, I couldn't agree more.
Okay.
But I think that the vision that they're giving you today is not exactly what it's going to be 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road. It's kind of scary when you think about it.
All right. Next question goes to Mr. France first. It's also on traffic of a sort. The state is studying taxing Connecticut residents on the miles they drive per year. Would you support such a tax?
Well, I can tell you that would probably bankrupt me. I put about 44,000 miles per year on my Tahoe, and I think it's about 200. Indeed, 204. Come along one of these days and see what that ride is like, and see if you really want this job. It's not fun. It's not fun at all. So anyway, do I think it's a good idea? No, I don't. It's an additional tax. The increase in rail fares of 24% in the last 4 years, and also the buses have gone up, not as much, but a significant amount, is another tax on all of us. The mileage tax is just purely another tax. And bear in mind, you would have a GPS transmitter, a transceiver in your car, so someone would know exactly where you are at all times, and they would know where you are going, where you've been, and they will tax you accordingly. 15 cents, 20 cents, 25 cents a mile. We don't know what that rate is, but they're so desperate for revenues. This is an organization that taxes hospitals, the most virtuous industry in the world known to mankind, and they tax hospitals to the tune where some are going to go belly up if they haven't already. Some have cut programs and divisions. They're merging because they can't produce a bottom line to save their lives, and they're desperate for anything. And they're looking at business activity taxes. They're looking at a statewide real estate tax, a mansion tax. If your house is worth over $500,000, there's going to be another 18 mills you have to pay.
All right, Mr. Blankley.
Well, let's stick with the mileage tax, shall we, before we start talking about all those other potential taxes that Scott has just mentioned. The mileage tax is a non-starter. If you look at my palm card, what they call the palm card, the oblong piece you'll find on the table out there, this evening it's free, otherwise it's available in fine bookstores everywhere. And you will see that item number 1 is no new taxes. The mileage tax is a pretty regressive kind of tax, and that's the kind of tax that I have been opposed to my entire life. Being a progressive, you understand.
All right. I think I'm going to go to the next question. It will go to Mr. Blankley first. Do you support repealing Connecticut's estate tax? If no, would you support raising the state exemption amount to the federal exemption amount?
The fact of the matter is that if people are leaving, and I suggested before that they are, but only to some extent, if there's one way that we can, I think, reverse that trend, it would be by making the state more acceptable to those who reach a certain stage in life, who may be thinking about going elsewhere. And definitely doing something about the estate tax in our state could be a useful thing to do. It brings in somewhere, I believe, between 120 and 140 million on average on an annual basis. I think bringing the threshold up to the federal level might be the way to go on that one. Otherwise, consult your estate and trust attorney.
Mr. France.
And when you do, they will tell you, don't die in Connecticut. Get the heck out of here. Especially if your kids are grown and off in college or graduated from college, get the heck out of Connecticut. It's the most expensive or second most expensive place to die in the country. And so do I support repealing it? Absolutely. I think repealing it would be the best, increasing the threshold or reducing the rate. Wouldn't cut it because it's the principle of it as well as it is the dollars and cents. People look at that and they say, that's just one more slap in the face from Connecticut. You know, we have 387 taxes in this state. 60 to 75 of them don't even hold their own. They don't pay for themselves. It's just part of this overall bureaucracy of people who have jobs to collect taxes, but it doesn't pay for itself. In my judgment, it's the most unproductive and kind of unproductive tax for the state, because what you do is you have people making a decision 55, 60 years old to move out of the state of Connecticut. Yes, they might keep their house here, but they don't want to take any chances, so they're here no more than 4.5, maybe 5 months at the most. And so all of their economic development contributions, their spending, their tax revenues on sales tax, their personal income, and ultimately, yes, their potential proceeds off of their estate in terms of revenues disappears. Now, and then that's not even including the subjective things, the things like, these wonderful people who help create an incredible community. I mean, is there any other town like Greenwich or New Canaan, Stamford in the 36th district? There aren't.
Okay. Any rebuttal or any extension, Mr.
I repeat my view that if we keep to the threshold that we have at the federal level and make the state tax comparable with that, that will go a long way towards balancing the attractiveness of our state for those in a certain age bracket with the need, frankly, to keep up revenues.
Okay, anything further, Mr. France?
We're good there. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Next question goes to Mr. France first. probably should be if, but how do you think the state employee pension plans should be restructured?
So the pension plans, all told, are well in excess of $60 billion. You've heard of other numbers that are lower than that, but when you do the actuarial analysis of it, we're looking at $62 billion, and then there's some other ones that bring the total unfunded liabilities up to about $72 billion. What can be done about it? I think there absolutely has to be some provision going forward to, once we move to a defined contribution plan for all future employees of the state of Connecticut, we have no choice, ladies and gentlemen, here. These promises that were made starting 60 and 70 years ago are completely unrealistic. We're not even going to come close to satisfying 35 or 40% of the liabilities down the road, in other words, their pension payments down the road. So we absolutely have to switch to a defined contribution plan as opposed to a defined benefit plan. And once we do that, then I think what we need to do is we need to go and have a serious discussion to talk about how much the state can really afford going forward. You know, a promise is a promise until that promise becomes unrealistic, and then at that point, you kind of have to negotiate about it. It's the way the business world works, right? We know that. And then you negotiate. You know, it's terrible that we've not funded this pension plan for as long as we should have, and it's terrible that we don't have quite the performance, and it's terrible that we have an assumed rate of return of 8.5%, which was just reduced to 8%. Ridiculous numbers. So we're probably less than 42% funded.
All right, Mr. Blankley.
I agree with large parts of what Scott says there. Doing something about the unfunded pension liability is one of the three things that I want to tackle. And as I said before, there is a plan on the table. That plan would essentially open negotiation with the unions. Unfortunately, it will have to be done. I know the story about a contract is a contract, but this is such a serious matter that I think we all have to share in some pain and some change. That change will involve a massive bond deal for $26 billion of the unfunded liability, converting the entire plan into individual accounts for all the pension holders and potential pensioners. And it gets away from this notion of 8% rate of return, which we know is not possible. If we can fund $26 billion of the obligation at current low rates, then that is going to be a significant way to go. It is a liability, whatever happens. But if we can fund it at a lower rate during this period of low interest rates, then I think this is a solution that we should be looking at. And what I want to know is, why has it not been pursued? I want to go to Hartford to put that on the table and really get it moving, along with the other two ideas that I have. Three ideas. So that's number one.
Okay, any rebuttal?
Yes, it's an intriguing proposal, and in fact, the author of it is in the room here tonight, standing in the back there. Andy, how are you tonight?
I haven't seen him.
And he's back there, trust me. And so I looked at this and found it to be a great intellectual, exercise, and to analyze whether this would actually do it or not. If you crunch the numbers on it, it does do it. It does do it if you make certain assumptions, and they might be a little bit too sanguine, but nonetheless, it definitely gets us going in the right direction. The only problem is this. It's a free market out there, and when you go to the, oh boy, I forgot.
Let me finish your thought. We talked about, or somebody did this evening, about what had happened in Rhode Island, and they have tackled this problem. I think it's up to Connecticut now to tackle this problem.
Okay, if you want further discussion.
Yeah, just
yes.
10 more seconds. The only problem is that the market, Mr. and Mrs. Bond Buyer, general obligation bond buyer, at some point will say no more debt for the state of Connecticut. We've already got $23.4 billion in bonded indebtedness. The rating agencies just downgraded us again yesterday. Yesterday. And when you're talking about doing another $26 billion on top of 23.4, the market will flip out, absolutely flip out.
If I could,
Certainly,
if
yes.
the matching part of that plan on the part of the unions is something that we can negotiate and get to happen, in other words, to have everything converted to a defined contribution, I think that will go a long way towards satisfying the bond market. And believe me, I've worked in the bond market. As I said before, I did the biggest high-yield bond deal that had ever been done in 1996. So the market can take it. And 26 billion actually in this market is not small, but it's certainly not the biggest deal that has been done.
Okay, that's time, and that was double rebuttal, so I really have to go to the next question. It goes to Mr. Blankley first. If elected, what could you do to prevent the closing of some of the state's technical high schools?
An article appeared in today's paper, written by Scott and Livy Florin, as a matter of fact. And so I'm very pleased that this question came up, because what I wanted to say was, I'm only sorry you didn't ask me if I would add my signature, because I would have done so. I thought it was an excellent article. If there's one thing we have to do to continue to attract Pratt & Whitney and Sikorsky and keep those businesses here, is to make sure that the labor that they need is well trained. And if there's one thing we have in our state, it is good technical colleges and good skilled labor, and we need to continue to promote that. So I believe in wholeheartedly in making that investment in that particular activity. I see it in my company. We employ systems engineers. That is very skilled work, and they are well trained in some of the colleges that are potentially, bless you, going to be closed by this proposal. So I'm all in favor of it. And when it comes to working across the aisle, I wasn't joking when I said I would have signed this letter. I really would have. And I would tout my credentials when it comes to working across the aisle. I feel I've done that quite successfully in this town on some of the projects that we have, that we've managed to get to happen here.
All right, Mr. France.
So, yes, if you haven't read it, there's a letter in today's Greenwich Time. You don't have to look at the picture, just look at the words. But it's all about the proposed reduced funding to the vocational technology schools. And Wright Tech, which is right here in our backyard, it happens to be in Livy Florin and my district, in the 36th district, is the most recent of the rebuilt Votech schools. And if you walk in there, it is magic. Everything that's great about the charter schools, they've adopted in the Votech setting, and the equipment that they have there is state-of-the-art. I'm a big believer in these Votech schools, because not everybody, has to have a, BA in this and, and a master's in this. There's a huge misplacement or displacement in the job market when you go out and you talk to literally hundreds of CFOs and CEOs of these companies, particularly in manufacturing. They're left high and dry because there are not enough people to fill those jobs, because they don't have the skills. A place like Wright Tech, which is a $200 million rebuild project, they're looking at a 10% across the board cut, which is what the governor's called for, would be devastated by this, because they're in the build-up mode right now. They've only been open for about 2 years, and if they get chopped off right now by the tune of 10%, they fall flat on their face, and it's going to hurt hundreds, if not over the course of time, thousands of kids. And John's right. We need to have some vibrancy at these schools, and 10% across the board is just not right.
Anything further, Mr. Blankley? Anything further?
No, we're good.
All right. Next question goes to Mr. France first. If the appellate court upholds the recent ruling on restructuring Connecticut's education system, what are your plans to enforce it, and what might be the impact on Greenwich Public Schools?
So it may be a completely moot point in the not-too-distant future, because the ruling has been appealed by the Attorney General, and it's usually 2 to 3 months before they come back. And it was interesting that Judge Mukhauser gave the legislature 180 days to come up with the legislation to enact what he wants. So clearly, I think he's going to get his wrist slapped because of his overstepping his bounds, as a person in the judiciary side of things. And I think that there are going to be some things that they point out as doable within the legislature, but asking him to do it within 180 days, like asking John to run to Portchester and back in the next 30 seconds. I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, or myself, it'll take me even longer. But that's how kind of out of touch the ruling was. There are some good parts of it and some bad parts. Good parts, they will get the education cost sharing plan figured out, and there will be more accountability for teachers. And you should, yellow or red?
Yellow.
You confusing me? Okay, yellow. So in that decision, the judge found that the ECS formula was completely irrational. And he was looking at the last 2 years in particular. And these are the kind of games that go on up in Hartford, which are just absolutely disgusting, where someone who was not going to vote for the budget last time around, and even 2 years ago, gets rewarded for having turned the corner and voting for the budget. So they get a Benny, they get a chocolate bar, and they get an extra $500,000 for their district.
Okay. Mr. Blankley.
So far be it from me as a Democrat to suggest that there should be no legislation from the bench. In this particular case, I think it's quite right. The judge overstepped, and I'd be pretty certain that the appeal will work from the Attorney General. That said, let's bear in mind that what we're really talking about here is making sure that everybody in the state of Connecticut gets a good public education, not just those in our fine town here in Greenwich. And the reason for that is it's good for business and it's good for all of us, because if everybody in places like Bridgeport and Hartford and New Haven are educated to the same standards that we have here, then it's good for the state overall. So we will get there, but a little more slowly than over the next 180 days.
Okay. Anything further, Mr. France?
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea is to provide, this goes back many years, about 30 years now, to a case decided by the Supreme Court in Connecticut that we had an unfair education system and that we need to get our act together and make sure that every kid in the state has access to a high-quality education. It doesn't have to be equal, but they have an access to that kind of educational opportunity. I agree with that. It's very noble. Implementing that is a very difficult thing to do, as we've seen over the years, but also as a result of this, the findings of this particular judge.
Anything further, Mr. Blankley? All right. Next question goes to Mr. Blankley first. And it's, again, one that was asked for the last part of the debate. Do you think that Connecticut's gun safety laws go far enough, and would you support increased restrictions on open carry?
When I first visited America, before we came to stay here, I landed at Washington Dulles Airport. And the big hall there was full of policemen with Stetsons and guns. And I thought, wow, this is America. But after a while, I began to realize that guns it's a different matter in my adopted country from elsewhere in the world. So I have to say, first off, you have to respect the Constitution, and I do respect the Second Amendment. Though I must say, if you read the book by retired Supreme Court Justice Stevens, you will see that he has a complete reinterpretation of the Second Amendment and says that the way it's been for the past 200 years simply isn't right. But that's by the by. I would propose for open carry that be repealed. We can't have it. I just don't like the idea of people moving around our streets, people who aren't sworn police officers, carrying guns openly. It is part of a gun culture, and I oppose that kind of gun culture. My daughter in Arizona, her family, they will not allow their 10-year-old son to go to a household that contains guns. So moving against the gun culture is something that I'm for, and the particular piece of legislation that I would target next will be open carry.
All right, Mr. France.
So we live in the second, if not the first most safe state when it comes to gun laws. That's been decided by at least two different groups, maybe even more, I don't know. But after the terrible, tragic shooting in Newtown several years ago, there was a huge debate, a huge argument, very vehement arguments on both sides of the issue. It wasn't necessarily a partisan issue. It was a principal issue. And we produced, the General Assembly, along with the governor, produced the most comprehensive gun safety bill in the entire country at that time. Now, another state may have surpassed us, but if you look at the numbers, we're still up there in the top two safest of the states. So we're good there. That was a step in the right direction, even though even though it did raise the eyebrows of many big Second Amendment supporters, of which I am, and I'm a sports person when it comes to handling rifles and shotguns. I think everybody does have the right to own a firearm as per the most recent interpretations of the Second Amendment. The fact is, in Connecticut, open carry is not an issue. I've been shooting since I was about 8 years old. I'm 56 now, so it's 48 years. And you go to a lot of different places where there are people who would, if they wanted to carry their guns in the open, their handguns in particular, they'd be doing it. They don't. They literally don't. It's not an issue. So moot point.
Anything further, Mr. Blackman?
It was certainly an issue last year in New Haven when a fellow carrying his gun openly, he had a permit for it, but he was approached by police and asked for his permit. And there was something of a standoff. Because ridiculously, it turns out that the police do not have the right to ask someone carrying a gun openly if they have a permit. And the attempt in the Assembly last year, in the last term, I should say, to make it possible for the police to challenge someone on that basis was turned down, unbelievably.
Anything further, Mr. France?
There might be some flexibility if this were an issue, but again, it's so isolated. There was that incident in New Haven. There was perhaps one other one in northeastern Connecticut, but it didn't amount to anything. No one got hurt in either of those two cases, I don't think. But if it were an issue, if people were getting shot by people carrying open handguns around with them openly, I think people would be reasonable and consider putting or making it a requirement that you have to put some sort of an indication that you do have a permit on your pistol holder.
Okay. Do you want
May I
another
have
rebuttal?
one
Yes.
small addendum?
Another 30 seconds.
Not rebuttal per se.
Yeah.
When I ran against Livy for the State Assembly 4 years ago, I found that on the matter of guns, there was no space between us whatsoever. I get an F from the NRA. Livy says famously that she gets an F, and she'd really like an F minus.
Anything
Very
further,
fine thing to
Mr.
say.
France?
We're good.
Okay. Next question goes to Mr. France first. Caregivers lose income because they have to stay home to care for adult children with autism or other disabilities. What, if anything, would you do to bring back funding for creating or keeping vital services and therapies for adults with disabilities?
This is the most heartbreaking thing about this job is that you come across, especially in times of fiscal crisis like we are in right now and have been basically for the last 6 or 7 years now, and you see the people who are hurt directly as a result of fiscal mismanagement. It's so bloody obvious what's going to happen if you grow your budget on average at 6.7% per year. Your cost structure does this, and your tax base simply can't afford it, or they don't want to pay for it, so they get up and they leave. And you end up in a situation where you have to do cut after cut after cut. Governor's called for cuts on all of these different social service areas, and whether it's substance abuse, addiction, people with disabilities, mental disabilities. It is heartbreaking, and you sit there and you say, why is it this way? 7.5 years ago, when you're going up there for your first session, the theme is let's get it together here, because if you don't, the people who need it the most are the ones who are going to suffer the most. And lo and behold, starting about 2.5 or 3 years ago, those are the ones who are falling right through the safety net, which is now like this big, porous, safety net. Little kids falling through, people with disabilities, people with mental problems falling through the safety net because the money's not there. And yet we still continue to go out and bond for $1 million statues throughout the state of Connecticut. We go out and build a bond for $2 million for a house that is going to house a mural, world's largest mural.
Okay. Mr. Blankley?
So the question is, what do we do about it? Scott describes the situation very well, and I agree. It is a disturbing situation. So what do? We don't fund these statues, and we don't fund some of the other things that may be unnecessary in that way. So it's always a problem when you need to make cuts, and we have had to make cuts the thing that you really want the most gets gored, and you shout and scream about it, and then the same thing happens to somebody else for their favorite project, and it gets gored. So somehow, by hook or by crook, in the Assembly and in the Senate, we need to have these competing interests come together. But I would say on this particular one, this is something that we must restore.
Okay, anything further?
I agree. There are some things you don't cut. You know, you're talking about VOTEC funding, or you're talking about kids or anybody who needs it, needs that kind of service or that kind of funding. You just don't do it because, you know, we all are in this business because we have a heart, a big heart, I would like to say, all of us. And we want to help other people. That's the sole reason why you get into this in the first place. And yes, the emphasis is on fiscal issues because at the end of the day, if you don't have a good fiscal house, you're not going to be able to take care of your own people. And that's when it becomes tragic. So you fight hard on those issues. And, you know.
Time, I'm afraid.
Sorry.
Sorry. Anything further, Mr. Blankley?
Nothing more at this point.
Okay. Next question goes to Mr. Blankley first. Given the state's tight budget, what are your plans to assist in combating Connecticut's heroin epidemic?
Well, obviously, this question was asked and answered in the last session, so I won't go through describing how bad the epidemic is. Some of the steps that have been talked about in terms of restricting the prescription that you get. So, for example, I had an implant in my tooth last year, and I had almost 30 days worth of Percocet. You know, it totally unnecessary. There is a bin, incidentally, if you don't know, in the police station where if you have any excess prescription drugs of that kind, you can deposit them. No questions asked. Just go in there and put it in there. We need to do a lot about treating people when they go to hospital. Make sure that when they come out, there is some ongoing help. If there's one thing I heard at a recent conference where our junior senator was present, who was talking incidentally about a $600 million federal plan to make Narcan available throughout the country, I spoke to the senior doctor from Stanford Hospital who said the major problem they have actually is not saving people. If they can get to people in time with the Narcan, they can save them. But when they go back out again, it is making sure you don't have that kind of recidivism. So quite what that program might be, whether it's volunteers or whatever, I'm not sure. But it's something in that area I think could start to be effective.
Okay.
I think education is a huge part of this. These drugs, these opioids these days are so addictive that literally in some cases when we talk about fentanyl and some of the other derivatives of heroin and opium, literally after the first or second use, you're hooked, and you're hooked for life unless you get help really quick. So the object is to keep people, especially younger people, and I know that there's an older age category that is suffering from opioid abuse as well. But if you can get these kids to understand that it will kill you, we need to be better parents about this. We need to stay on top of our kids and not let them get into trouble. Literally, there are gangs that go and they buy this fentanyl. A lot of it's cheaply made in China these days, or perhaps in Mexico, and they go around the country to small towns in New England. Right here in Connecticut, we have 7 towns that are on the literally death watch because of all the kids and middle-aged people are hooked on heroin. And so you need to stop that somehow. So better law enforcement, better education, and you know, why are we taking these drugs in the first place? We need to really understand what societally, if that's a word, are we doing wrong, that kids and other folks have to go out and do this? What's wrong with playing soccer? What's wrong with going out and playing bocce ball? What's wrong with, you know, going to the beach and reading a really good book and not enjoying life to its fullest extent by doing those things? You know, what's wrong?
Okay, anything further, Mr. Blankley?
Just to say that I think it should be clear to everyone that the political class, if I can put myself in the same class as Scott here, we are united in trying to find solutions to this problem.
Indeed.
Anything further?
Indeed.
Okay. Next question goes to Mr. France first. What would you recommend to increase international commerce in Connecticut? As part of this, would you support the build-out of the port in Bridgeport?
So the best economic development policy that one can have is creating a really good business environment, and just trying to so good that you have to beat people away from coming into Connecticut. We have no more space for manufacturing, no more space for whatever. It's quite the opposite there. What happens is we've created such a bad business environment, typically between 43 and 50, depending on which source you go to in terms of the rankings, and that's on the bottom end of things. How do we get people here? First thing we need to do is improve our business environment. How are we going to do that? First thing you do is you fix the fiscal house. You got to fix the balance sheet. You got to fix the budget, which is a constant nightmare. Even our own budget director, Ben Barnes, will tell you that Connecticut will always be in a state of perpetual fiscal crisis. He's also the guy that, when actually it was me who was asking him in a finance committee grilling, why are you taxing hospitals? And he looked at me, and this is all on camera in front of 100 people. He said, why do you think bank robbers go to the bank? It's where the money is. So, that sort of stuff sends a really bad message out there. So it makes it very difficult to recruit companies from around the state of Connecticut, let alone from Europe or China, where the costs of doing business are typically a lot lower. Should we use the port of Bridgeport? Specifically that one, we've looked at that. I've looked at that for nearly 20 years as a possibility for a lot of different reasons. And we had Brewers Yacht Yard there for a long time building large vessels, but the city can't handle it.
All right, same question, Mr. Blankley?
Scott, I'm surprised you don't mention Bradley International Airport. If we're talking international here, that's something that we ought to be looking at. I can't see, frankly, with Bridgeport that's not going to make it internationally. There may be other things that can happen there in terms of something that was suggested earlier, in terms of getting freight off the roads and onto ships. But that's another matter. This question of the business climate in Connecticut. Forbes magazine, yes, they put us at 45th, I want to say. And I took the trouble, this came out last year, I took the trouble to actually go and look at it. And it turns out that a major part of it was whether there are income taxes in the state, and a major part of it was infrastructure and roads. And it turns out that the top 5 states in Forbes' list were the old states of the Confederacy. And when I saw that, I thought, you know what, there's something awry here about this particular study. I don't bite. I started a business here 15 years ago. There is nothing in terms of business climate, taxes, regulation, whatever, that has held me back. There is no regulation which, removed, would have made me more entrepreneurial. There is absolutely nothing holding business back. Businesses come here and they stay here. So I will not suffer this notion that it's a bad place to do business. It's a great place to do business.
Okay, any rebuttal, Mr. France?
Yeah, sure. John runs such a great ship, and I'm being serious about this, that he probably doesn't notice the challenges that most other people do. When you're as successful as he is, life is pretty easy. The cruising's pretty smooth. But, when you go talk to manufacturers, particularly in the northwestern part of the state where there are some very old manufacturers. In fact, there's a 173-year-old manufacturing outfit that just moved out of the state of Connecticut for all of the reasons that I was mentioning before, overregulation, where you have a Department of Labor that just hounds you every day. I rest my case.
All right, Mr. Blankley. Rebuttal?
Yes. In early 2009, our senior salesman came to me and he said, well, we didn't actually sell anything today. And the next day he said, well, it's been another day. We didn't actually sell anything. Within another 2 or 3 days, I and my partners got together and we were preparing a plan for layoffs in our company. Yes, business is good right now. We are hiring right now. But it's been a rocky couple of moments during that 15-year period.
At this point, unfortunately, I am going to have to stop the questions. We get to the closing statements. By luck of the draw, Mr. France will do the first close and Mr. Blankley will do the second.
Thank you, Gene. You've done a great job tonight, and thank you, League of Women Voters, for putting on the debate in the first place. It's always fun to be up here, and I want to thank John also for his participation here. He and I are actually very good friends. We get along great, and we have a lot of laughs together, and he's a wonderful guy, and he serves the town of Greenwich quite well. So thank you, John, for your civility and also for making it a very sporting race so far. It's a tough job, but I love it because I love challenges, and I love jobs where you can actually feel passionate about things and you can actually put your heart and soul into helping people. That's one of the best parts about the job, is helping constituents that are deeply in trouble or deeply in need. And that is by far and away the most gratifying part of the job. Also, as gratifying is when you know that you're part of the larger conversation where you are influencing positively some very important public policies. In particular, in the areas of fiscal issues, we are so challenged these days. The math is not working for the state of Connecticut. It has not worked for over a decade now, and the future is looking pretty grim unless we get our hands around it. And my big thing up in Hartford has been to try to keep taxes, the increase in taxes, as low as possible. Majority Party's been in charge here for a long time, for a generation and a half, and they've set up a situation where you have to increase taxes every year. As ranking member of the Finance and Revenue Bonding Committee, you know, the senior ranking member, I know the co-chairs very well, and we happen to be extremely good friends. And we will go have a beer every once in a while, and we will discuss tax policy. And in those conversations, I get them to knock down their proposal from, 8.5% to 7.99%. But knowing those people is crucial. It's a great job. I do worry about the future generation of Connecticut. I do worry about our generation as well. We have close to $100 billion in unfunded liabilities, as I told you before, and bonded indebtedness. If we don't get to work on that, we're being cruel to our population. Thank you all so very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Mr. Blankley.
So let me reciprocate with my words as well. Indeed, Scott is right. We do get on very well. I remember there was one occasion last year we were laughing and joking. I said, well, we better be careful that the voters don't see us. This is a serious question, a serious job, and I have 3 proposals to put on the table, one for infrastructure, one for the unfunded pension liability, and one for job creation. There's a whole bunch of other things that I could have talked about in terms of the environment, in terms of education, and so on and so forth. But if we don't get some of the issues that I think, where I have plans, out there on the table and start working on them, then all the other things don't matter so much. It is very important, however, that we keep a perspective on this. So I will come back to this point. There is a solution. I have some of the solutions. Others have some of the solutions. I'm not unique in this. The ideas I have are not unique to me. They're ideas that Andy Duce, at least one of them, put on the table. There's another that I see Deirdre Kamlani there, her husband, put on the table as far as the infrastructure bank is concerned. These are solutions. There is hope. And I will finish by saying it is morning again in Connecticut.
Thank you on behalf of the League to the timers, the question screeners, the runners, and all the audience members, and to both candidates. And you know what I'm going to say now. On November 8th, guys, get to the polls and get your friends to the polls. It's up to you.